Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be with us here this morning. Good morning and welcome to another episode of Your Library at Home. The Scholar Talks are all being done online now, regardless of whether the library's doors are physically open or not, as we've started recording these and having them transcribed and making them available for further reference on our website. So do look out on our website for episodes that you might have missed or for talks that you might like to see again. Today we have Dr. Sophie Robinson talking about her research at the library as the 2020 Nancy Keesing Fellow. Sophie was looking in great detail at our collections of Wicked Women and Lesbians on the Loose and looking at those publications and what they brought to Sydney in the 1990s. If you have any questions for Sophie, she'll be keen to answer them. So you can just pop them using the chat feature in Zoom, and we'll come to those after Sophie's presentation. So here's Sophie. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for the introduction, and thanks also to the State Library of New South Wales for hosting this talk and the Nancy Keesing Fellowship as well for so generously backing this research over the past year. I've received a lot of support from the library for this project, much of it having taken place in the context of a pandemic and now again in another lockdown, though it's definitely a privilege to be doing this research from my home, tracing the history of lesbians in Sydney in the 1990s through these amazing publications, Lesbians on the Loose and Loddle, having this kind of incredible archive of magazines to pour through, articles and all the content and all the amazing effort in putting those magazines together over its long history. So I am also enjoying doing this research from home. So as Rachel introduced, I'm a historian whose research focuses on the development of lesbian politics and culture and activism in Australia since the emergence of the key sexual liberation movements of the 1970s, namely Australian Women's Liberation, Gay Liberation, and Campaign Against Moral Persecution, or CAMP as it was known. Lesbians and queer women were key participants in these movements, and from within them they developed a distinct lesbian feminist politics and culture in Australia that was both connected and separate to these broader movements, but flourished and diversified well into the 1980s and 1990s and is still evolving to this day. During the 1990s in particular, two publications circulated and communicated a lot of information within the lesbian and queer women scene in Sydney. They were Wicked Women, subtitled Dyke Decadence, and Lesbians on the Loose, or Loddle as is more fondly known. Wicked Women, which began publication in 1988, included articles, photography, prose, poetry, personal ads and more celebrating diverse lesbian sexuality and erotica. Loddle was Australia's first free magazine that aimed to be a voice for lesbians around Australia. Both were published and based out of Sydney, though their reach was expansive across the nation. In a recent oral history interview I was very privileged to conduct with Loddle's founding editor, Frances Rand, she noted the uniqueness of both magazines appearing at the same time, where they overlapped and also where they differed. I always thought it was funny that Wicked Women had come out before us, Frances explained, because it was such a specific publication. I used to go to all of their Wicked Women events. They were good, they were fun. It was great to have some sex positive things happening, and they were certainly popular in the 90s. Indeed, both Wicked Women and Loddle represented a thriving, politically driven and often sexually adventurous and entrepreneurial lesbian scene in the 1990s. Though as I found in my research for a long time now, going back to my doctoral research on the history of lesbian feminist activism over a few decades, this is a narrative that's often lost or overlooked. I know from my previous research that there are way more stories, encounters, events, and debates that need to go on the historical record about this time and about these different lesbian communities and the way they were intertwined. And it was this feeling of needing to counterbalance dominant narratives of lesbian culture, community, and identity that was what led me to want to analyse the library's archive of Loddle and Wicked Women to consider ways to tell a lesbian-oriented cultural history of Sydney. I wanted to show that Australian lesbian communities have never been monolithic, especially during the 1990s, as lesbian activism was expanding into a range of areas, including sexual health activism, sex radicalism, anti-violence activism, and more. Another big motivation to do this research was to explore and highlight the State Library's extremely important collection of queer archives, which are quite expansive, but not always obvious to people unfamiliar with the collection. And I know this is something that the State Library is working on shifting through creating some specific research guides for those interested in conducting research into Australian queer histories, which is really exciting. I'll also flag that, of course, the global pandemic that we've been facing since the beginning of 2020 definitely presented some unique pressures and setbacks in this research, not being able to access the library for some time and then intermittently. But I was thankful for some excellent assistance with special collections once we could return to the library. And also that much of the Loddle archive, thankfully, has been digitised and is available online through Trove, which is amazing. And so as such, the Loddle archives necessarily became a really key focus for this research fellowship. Something that I think is perhaps unique to queer and feminist historians, though for anyone trying to trace stories and voices in the archive that are not immediately apparent or obvious or visible, is that we often have to get creative with the archives that we draw upon and our methodologies. And I've been reflecting a lot on the other resources that have helped me conduct this fellowship research. The many conversations, as well as interviews, anecdotes from people connected to both magazines as writers and as audience. So many people I have found have a story or a memory or some sort of experience linked to Wicked Women and Loddle in terms of reading those magazines, in writing for them. So many people I've found have copies of these magazines sitting in their home, their own personal archives. And so many have memories in particular of picking up their first Loddle, where they would go specifically to pick it up and walk by and grab a copy. Or memories of their first Wicked Women event. And all of these anecdotes have been incredibly crucial to this fellowship research that I'll be sharing today. So tracing Loddle's history, which began first with Frances Rand and Jazz Ishtar in 1990, and then Rand and together with Barbara Farrelly, who was also the first female editor of the Sydney Star Observer, I saw so much evidence of an expanding and confident lesbian presence in the gay commercial and cultural scene of Sydney and broader Australia. In all the diverse articles, events, lifestyle politics, writing and creativity represented in Loddle by and for lesbians and an increasingly queer-identified female readership. Wicked Women, started by Jasper Labert and Talisa Salmon, began in large part because they were wanting to connect with more people in the lesbian and queer community interested in BDSM and kink subcultures. Their efforts also highlighted a very distinct sexual revolution going on in Sydney at this time amongst lesbians and queer women, of which more research is really needed, especially to highlight the outpouring of creative responses to sexual liberation and sexual health, and empowering lesbians in this time to be very proud of their identity, their communities, and where they'd come from, their history. As Frances Rand similarly commented in the interview with me about her impetus for starting Loddle, the 1990s was a really important time to say we are here, we are okay, and we are not going away. And I think Loddle was a big part of increasing lesbian visibility. I was happy for whoever to pick it up, gay, straight, male, female. I just thought whoever read it would learn more about us as something positive for the lesbian community, something that helped it grow, something that was welcoming for all lesbians, and something that lesbians loved. More and more spaces and resources like Lotl and Wicked Women were emerging that highlighted new possibilities for lesbian lives. Political activism and feminist networks had really defined Sydney's lesbian community since the 1970s and into the 80s. And in many ways, the confidence gained from these years had really propelled lesbians forward by the 1990s to locate other ways of empowering themselves as lesbians, as women, whether that was pioneering sexual health activism, their performance art, their erotica, through publishing, and many more other forms of activism to continue what was already a very strong feminist agenda of enhancing lesbian visibility. I asked Frances to talk me through the early days of Lotl and what led her to start it in the first place. She'd been working at the ABC along with Jazz Ishtar, and both had got talking about how hard it was to find out what was on for lesbians. At that time, she said there was Lesbian Network, which came out quarterly, starting in the early 1980s and going through to the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s, or the Star Observer, which was mainly gay male. Frances said there wasn't much lesbian news in it at all. There was just a big gap, you know, for lesbians to know what was happening. I wanted to make it free so that people could pick it up easily and just to reach the widest audience possible, which meant you'd have to sell advertising for it. Though we didn't sell advertising for the first issue, we let anyone advertise for free. And in the end, Mardi Gras came across and wanted to have a full page ad and said they'd pay half our printing costs, and off we went. Mardi Gras was a wonderful support, Frances continued, and it was mutual. I'm pretty sure we delivered a lot more lesbians to Mardi Gras events. Coalition grew and was wonderful in that time, and women were definitely taking a bigger role in the coalition movement. Like Lotl, Wicked Women was starting to fill a gap in representing parts of the lesbian community, to be a voice for a broad array of interests as well as desires. Both Jasper and Talisa were keen to find others interested in their world of S&M, and they assumed many others were out there, though it was hard, Jasper recalled in an interview I conducted with him as part of my previous research on Wicked Women. There were no publications, no notice boards you could go to. The magazine, which ran until 1996, had a precarious beginning, largely because of its experimental and provocative content. The explicit lesbian porn and photographs used, for instance, were deemed so taboo that some printers refused to print it. According to Jasper, virtually no one except for a handful of gay male businesses were advertising it. The feminist bookshop stocked it, but it was often hidden underneath other feminist publications. Articles in Wicked Women encompassed a range of topics relevant to the broader sex radical community around Australia, from reports on interstate and international S&M performances to profiles on lesbian Sydney DJs who are a core part of this scene, through to erotic fiction, commentary on community politics such as lesbian visibility in the gay male commercial scene, and Mardi Gras especially, and also reviews of sex toys for women. The Miss Wicked contests and parties that financially supported and went in tandem with the Wicked Women magazine also became their own cultural sensation in Sydney in the 1990s. And they were a really important space for the sex radical lesbian community and the emerging queer and trans scenes to express themselves and foster collective solidarity in the community. Margaret Henderson, an Australian feminist scholar writing in the Australian Journal of Pop Culture, talked about her first experience of attending a Miss Wicked event in the late 1980s. She said, "It was the late 1980s and my friends and I were on our way to a venue, an ex-warehouse in Sydney. We climbed the steep stairs and entered a large, dark and crowded room buzzing with expectation. A lesbian event," Henderson noted, "would have more likely included a folk singer and an acoustic guitar, and the cause might have been Nicaragua or a women's refuge. What she entered was very different and unlike any women's bar she'd ever been to. It was hard to see the stage. Was that naked flesh? It was hard to hear what women were saying above the industrial punk music. A different dress code, women in uniforms and leather, and a different atmosphere, intense, serious, and somewhat uncertain. The Wicked Women scene, especially these contests and parties, offered a new sexual avant-garde for lesbians. But this could also be a confronting and sometimes alienating space for some. In addition to concerns that it was departing from sort of lesbian feminist culture of the time, some also have remarked to me and elsewhere that it felt like also a very exclusive space, quite cool, too cool for some. But the events proved to be extremely popular. The presence, though, of these events and this Wicked contest were very controversial, and as well as the magazine. And by the early 1990s, there were a lot of events, publications, articles, and public debates in both Loddle and Wicked Women and other forums where discussions and arguments about the role of power and desire and sex in lesbian lives were raging amongst lesbian and feminist communities, though these were hardly new conversations. Both Loddle and Wicked Women were covering and leading these debates in their own ways in the 90s, referencing each other, talking to each other. These communities were very much entwined as much as they were separate. In the 50th year anniversary issue of Loddle in 1995, one article, for instance, highlighted that the hottest debate of those first few years of the magazine had in fact been the greater visibility of sex radical lesbian communities and Wicked Women magazine. Loddle's second issue back in 1990 had also advertised the upcoming Miss Wicked contest, where contestants were encouraged to perform their most wicked sexual fantasy or identity. And a later issue of Loddle had pictured the crowned winner, Skye, as well as other lesbian sex and play party events. And they definitely received both applause and criticism from readers for this. Another piece in the same issue from 1990 defended the new sex radical content pouring out of the lesbian scene, arguing that it was a positive sign of a developing lesbian gaze and, quote, creating a space in the visual language where we can have a gaze, a choice, and express ourselves. Frances also added, as much as she was reporting positively on the community of Wicked Women, that she did remember there were also some lesbians that were opposed to anything that I did. I remember getting a bit of flack for running articles that were very much pro what they were doing, or even about what what specifically they were doing on stage. However, Frances's relationship with Jasper was very friendly. Frances noted that Jasper thought I was very vanilla in comparison to the events and community that Jasper was a part of, but Frances said that they got on fine, that there was a feeling that there was room for everybody. But not everyone felt that way, Frances noted, and some people were really confronted by that. And some lesbians really didn't think that Wicked Women and sex radicalism should have a part. While so-called sex radicals perhaps presented a generational shift in lesbian activism in Sydney in the 1990s, centred around parties and performances and offering new spaces for younger same-sex attracted women to explore themselves, lesbian feminist and sex radical scenes were not mutually exclusive, and Loddle and Wicked Women highlight that distinctly, especially the communication between them in those early years, those first few years of Loddle in particular, and the articles run about Wicked Women. Loddle, meanwhile, did try to reach a broad demographic, as Frances explained. My thinking was that Loddle was for all lesbians, whoever they were. There hadn't been a publication that catered to all lesbians prior to Loddle. Lesbian Network catered more to lesbian separatists, and Wicked Women to SM lesbians. Most lesbians wouldn't fit into either of these communities, Frances said. Loddle, meanwhile, projected more of a middle-of-the-road image, kind of like a women's weekly for lesbians. Within that, though, we could cater to all sorts. We would publish articles about Muslim lesbians, lesbian mums, lesbian sex workers, sporty dykes, and so on. What has been really amazing in this project was that in addition to accessing past issues of Loddle, I was also able to access an extensive personal archive through the library, deposited to the State Library by Frances, including folders and folders within folders of correspondence, business records, photographs, newsletters, cuttings, articles, advertising, conference information, festival information, basically all the copy that Frances and Barbara would have received, and delving through all the material that Frances had kept and deposited with the library, all the specific pieces of paper, marginalia, ephemera, drafts, and notes made on pages and draft copy. I was really struck by the immense effort and intention required of her and Barb, working from home from 1993 full-time on this publication as they attended to the immense copy that came their way. All the advertisements, the personals and classifieds as well, political reports, submissions from the Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby, opinion pieces and correspondence. And in comparing and contrasting with actual issues of Loddle as well, and just seeing how much content did actually get in and their dedication to that, to getting people's stories and submissions into the magazine is very remarkable. I asked Frances about her decision to deposit these archives with the library, how she hoped they would be used and understood. She said she hoped, of course, that researchers like me would come along and see that this history matters. What we deposited, Frances explained, was a whole working archive and stories we were working on at the time, though the full archive is yet to be deposited, and what's not there is possibly even more interesting. We thought Loddle had an important role in the development of the lesbian community in the 1990s, and that one day that history would be analysed and understood in the context of the growth of acceptance of lesbians and granting of equal rights. What I also found within these personal papers were many signs and paper trails of the broader phenomenon happening in the lesbian community in the 1990s as it was expanding its sexual and identity politics. There were signs, for instance, of the ongoing sex debates, the debates between wicked women and some sections of the lesbian feminist community, for instance, questions about the links between feminism and lesbianism. Did you have to be a feminist to be a lesbian and vice versa? And also many more on the ground, grassroots, interpersonal dialogues and conversations between members of the community, some quite difficult, centering on issues within the community of lateral violence, microaggressions, abuse and conflict. Reflections also on the difficult and intense work of activism, of developing lesbian community in the face of ongoing discrimination, homophobia and sexism. The longing expressed more and more to create new forms of family and kinship without the structures and laws that exist today to support these choices, all communicated to Loddle's editors to go in issues of the magazine. Frances said that we saw Loddle as being the journal of record for the lesbian community. If it happened to a lesbian, we wrote about it. So I think it records the history of the period rather well. Key changes like the baby boom really started in the 1990s, and obviously it's a complex issue. There are so many decisions you need to make as a lesbian if you want to have children. So there were quite a few stories about that. And one of the more popular issues we had Ellen DeGeneres on the cover with the heading "Ellen's Out," and we beat time to the story. Frances also noted the particular pool of stories for her about the real life consequences of lesbians still living amongst homophobia and discrimination, whilst also trying to lead full lives. Stories about wills and next of kin. They were always so sad, Frances said. There were often stories about women losing their partners and being cut off of family decisions, and those stories were always so sad. Also, trawling as I did through the handwritten classifieds and personal ads of both magazines, probably my favourite part of this research was the deep reliance on them to build community, to locate lovers, friendships, even band members for their all-women bands, finding women to join their BDSM groups or their rural land projects. As Frances added, I really loved getting all the personals, seeing all the people we were connecting. I loved the letters and I loved getting letters from people. And indeed, another informant for this research was emphatic that these personals were a huge, if not the reason that they and other lesbians picked up Loddle, pouring through those personals, which went over a couple of pages for a while, as followed by as well the sport information, event information, photos of what's on, photos of events that had happened in the lesbian community. And they remarked that if it wasn't for that sport information, for instance, they wouldn't have joined a lesbian basketball team at the age of 17. So it was a really critical and core piece of information about their community for so many lesbians. And yes, the personals were a very big drawing card for them. There were some particularly favourite personals that I came across, handwritten ones sent in to Francis and Barb, that I find especially compelling in an age dominated by online apps and forums. One wrote, "Women with a van, available for light removals and safe rides home." Another said, "Intelligent, caring lesbian, 31, seeks a kindred spirit, professional woman with interests in riding, cycling, permaculture, bushwalking and conservation, would like to make new friends." Another advertised lesbian plumber, a lesbian mechanic, and another was looking for a sperm donor for a dyke couple. Locally and globally, there is growing interest in these kinds of queer archives and histories, and specific attention to these kinds of publications as well. Overseas, in the US, there's sort of growing interest in doing histories of Curve magazine, for instance, which has some distinct links to Loddle as well. And recently there's been some great efforts to create a mini-series about Wicked Women, to explore the social and cultural and personal histories and impact of that magazine, which is amazing. I can't wait for that. Going forward, there is so much more to be done and said about these magazines, more to analyse and look at in terms of Wicked Women especially, which I'm looking forward to, and also more interviews to collect from the magazine's audiences, people who actually read and devoured their pages and content and participated in the community represented within them. My aim personally is to ensure more cultural histories of lesbian Sydney and lesbian politics and activism in Australia are written, recorded and shared, and that libraries as well as community archives and community history groups continue to both be crucial sites in which queer collections are housed for future generations of researchers. And there's definitely a lot more to say about the 1990s in particular, and more research to collate around this, as this was a really critical time in expanding lesbian visibility, especially in the gay commercial scene, and as well as in areas of community leadership, such as Mardi Gras with the election of Kath Phillips as president, and leadership roles held by lesbians in the gay and lesbian rights lobby, in ACON, as well as in bars, businesses, as DJs, event promoters, and so on. Finally, I have done most of this research, as I said, beginning from home in my lounge room, relying on archival evidence I had thankfully already collated for Wicked Women and Loddle, as well as the amazing online repository of Loddle, in addition to interviews and conversations with key informants, especially people who read the magazines. And as ever, these methods of queer historical research have to be diverse. And the amount of conversations I've had with people about the magazines, the role in their life, how they were read, consumed, and engaged with has been a critical factor, and piecing together the impact of the magazine and their legacies. Even my own memories of Loddle, the first time I picked up a copy from a chemist in Newtown, sort of following this history of many more before me who probably have done the same thing, but it felt like I was the first person to ever do it at that time. Reflecting on that and the place of Loddle in my life has been wonderful as well. As a living archive, Wicked Women and Loddle's relevance and legacies is an unfinished story, and I look forward to uncovering it further through the State Library. And I thank you very much for listening to today. And if you have any comments or questions, I'm really looking forward to hearing them. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sophie. You've been hugely busy and doing extraordinarily well, I think, with all the additional pressures on research at the moment and access to the library. We do have a few questions coming through. The first one is, with lesbian history, such a rich and diverse history, and then the huge body of history around activism, what drew you specifically to publishing history?
I think publishing history, especially within lesbian communities, has always been really strong. Lesbians have needed to communicate with each other in a range of ways. And I think going back to the early sort of 1970s, feminist groups and lesbian feminist groups, the newsletters and writing and poetry and literature that kind of came pouring out of those groups and connected lesbian groups with each other, sort of highlighting that they were there, they were proud of who they were, and they wanted to explore who they were in a range of ways. That led to more and more kinds of publications, and highlighted the need to assert a lesbian voice in media, in literature. And this again led to things like Lotl and Wicked Women as well, starting as it did to sort of fill that gap in the lesbian community and communicating between sort of the subcultures within lesbian communities.
There's a really great question about intersections that you might have come across, and if there have been any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lesbians involved in publishing or in just featuring in some of the publications that you've mentioned today.
Yeah, I think certainly within Lotl, there's definitely articles about Aboriginal women, Aboriginal lesbians, and I guess issues faced within Australia by Aboriginal people, but especially around sort of reconciliation and the early 2000s, there's more and more articles highlighting key issues that were finally being talked about in Australia, including in particular the stolen generation and key pieces around those broader discussions happening in Australia. But obviously lesbians have been, especially lesbian activists, have been really heavily involved in anti-racist, decolonising activism for a long time. And so I think it's obviously always been on the radar of sort of lesbian activist groups. And so we definitely see that reflected in magazines like Lotl over time.
Really fascinating question so you're well known for really honing your craft and your methodology and actually how you do history. And so this question is about the difference between the anecdotes that you've been talking about in today's presentation and more formal oral histories. So with anecdotes, how do you collate them? How would you cite them? How would you exploit these as sort of their own little mini archive?
I think that's a great question. It's something I think about constantly because, yes, I do engage with oral histories for the majority of my research. I feel like that's where we get a real kind of living archive, is through voices and listening to people's stories. I think anecdotal evidence is its own kind of science and key methodology for historical research as well. It's definitely collected and collated differently. It can be in the form of casual conversations or gossip or off the record comments. And I definitely take note of all those things and record them in my kind of general observations as I'm researching along the way, and think about what they're telling me about this kind of broader archive and communicating sort of the gaps as well. I think anecdotes are really key for communicating the things that are often unsaid, or the kind of emotions attached to certain events, or, you know, as for instance with Lotl, we know it was a magazine, we know it sort of grew and grew, we know it was a voice for the lesbian community, but how did it actually feel to see Lotl, to read Lotl, to engage with it? Why do people keep their copies of Lotl? Yes, formal oral history interviews will help reveal that, but it's in those kind of anecdotal comments within the community where you hear that kind of and get that kind of evidence and start to really understand the impact and legacies of these kinds of publications and this kind of history, I guess.
Lots more questions coming in. We've also got a comment. Now, I don't normally read these, but this is a really lovely thing for you, Sophie. This is fascinating and important research, exclamation marks included. Thank you for your great presentation. It was wonderful to listen to you and to find out more about what we can find of lesbian history in the archives. So opening a doorway to somebody else there, I think.
Lovely comment. Thank you.
So here's a question. How do you think your work can be utilised to combat the impact of ageism in older lesbians?
A great question as well. I guess it's interesting because all of this research that I've been doing, it's tracing the history of lesbian activism from the 1970s. So a lot of the people I'm talking about, the kind of front runners, the vanguard of these movements and these groups are aging. They're older women now. And it's been a really key part of my research is, tracing their lives and their activism and where they're at now. And also just highlighting their incredible contributions and history. And I think the more that those kinds of stories are out there in the community, and we can kind of trace back and link up kind of current and past lesbian feminist communities, there can be greater appreciation for the histories of these women, and maybe a capacity to kind of move past what can be often an overlooking of older women's experiences, and think kind of quite critically about what a lot of older lesbian women and older feminist activists have had to go through and have been involved in, often in a vacuum of any other existing kind of services or groups or rights or legislation that we have today. So I guess in that way, it's just kind of honouring these full lives of women that we might not normally look at and realise they're connected to all these incredible moments in Australia's very recent history of challenging sex and gender discrimination. So I think in that way, I think it's definitely challenging some ageist focus in queer histories and queer communities. So I think that's great. And I think the majority of people I speak to are women in their 60s and 70s and getting their stories. So that's definitely how I approach it.
Yeah, the activism never stops. Somebody's asking, they're just curious, have you done any research on representations of butch femme communities in Sydney? And if yes, what did you find?
Yes, I have done research on that. There's incredible existing research that preceded mine by the excellent historian Rebecca Jennings, who did a really great cultural history of Sydney and also conducted oral histories along with some other academics of women who in the 60s as well as the 50s, actually going back further into the 40s and then into the 1970s, who were part of some really early lesbian social groups and networks, of which butch femme roles, identities, aesthetics had a part. It's quite a different kind of butch femme history to sort of ones that have existed overseas, particularly in America and parts of New York, where we have some amazing rich cultural histories written about them. But yes, there are definitely instances of that and important histories of that. What I found is that butch femme communities, especially in the kind of 50s and 60s, were often hidden and subcultural, obviously existing in and around the bar scene culture, the commercial scene. They were a key way to express lesbian desire and identity covertly and secretly, but also a beautiful way to have fun and express themselves. But also with the 1970s, the emergence of lesbian feminist activism and kind of challenging certain gender roles and gender stereotypes, there was some kind of debates and kind of concerns and discussions about what a butch femme kind of identity or aesthetic kind of what it meant and reflected about gender roles in the lesbian community. And so there's kind of some divisions and debates there between lesbian feminist and butch femme communities, but these were also very much intertwined communities as well, and not totally distinct. And we see I've noticed lots of overlap and less division and more overlap between those communities into the 70s and 80s, for instance. And then in the 80s and 90s, there's also kind of like a revival of butch femme within the leather, lesbian, BDSM sort of scene and subcultures. So it's got a really great history in Sydney.
And somebody's asking, you mentioned apps and different ways to communicate now. So they're asking about the digital world of social media that is the main mechanism for community building now versus the magazines that you've been talking about this morning. How should libraries and researchers be building their digital archives of social media, and what sort of processes would you recommend so that the current version of the personal pages that were obviously such a rich source for you in this research, that sort of reimagination of those isn't lost?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel very unskilled in knowing how to answer that, but I think, things like incorporating more oral histories and ethnographies within the archive to kind of add to anecdotally and on the record people's reactions and experiences of those kind of archives and of that kind of living history component is a really important way. Or in terms of apps and social media, I think there's so much going on for the lesbian and queer community online. Thinking about ways to kind of reflect that and make sure it's kind of shown and reflected in the archive of this always changing queer history in Sydney is a really interesting question. I would say, more podcasts, more recorded oral histories, more videos and media to sort of bring all these things together and really make it a living archive. But that's a great question. I'm not quite sure of the answer.
I might have to drop a note to the people who collect social media at the State Library and ask them to set up some specific searches that we can do to make sure that we have that in our electronic or digital archive. We've got another comment, just chatting briefly about the Lesbian Network, founded in 1984, and just pointing out that they had an Australia-wide membership and as an organisation were very feminist, not particularly lesbian or separatist, as some people have suggested. So it's quite an interesting difference from Loddle or Wicked Women, but took support from those publications, and there was a role for supporters of both. So that's an interesting comment that we've got. Somebody's asking another access question. You mentioned that Lesbians on the Loose has been digitised. So that's available through Trove or through All Good library catalogues. Do you know if Wicked Women has been identified for digitisation as well, or is that something we need to ask for?
I don't think so. I wonder about that, and if that's I'm not sure if it has or will be. I think there's maybe perhaps even more sensitive content, and thinking about ways to do that is interesting. I would love it to be digitized. I think that would be excellent, and I would hope so eventually.
What every researcher wants, another project suggestion. Somebody's asking if you're going to write some entries about these magazine founders for the Australian Dictionary of Biography.
Oh, sure, I can do that. I would love to.
I think that's a great suggestion. Just pop it on your to-do list.
Yeah.
Somebody's asking you to come forward in time a little bit. So you've really focused on the 1990s. What's been happening since in publishing?
Well, if I think about Loddle's history and moving forward into the 2000s and look at that to kind of reflect on lesbian publishing and its changes, I know that when Loddle was sold sort of into the early 2000s, it became more of a kind of lifestyle magazine. I think it was not necessarily less political, but I think it became less, there was less news content around kind of lesbian activism and its kind of, all its kind of multiplicities. And I think in part that's been interesting for me to reflect on what has been happening with lesbian activism into the 2000s and lesbian and queer culture, definitely moving a lot more online, online publications, online content, more kind of global websites relevant to kind of lesbian and queer communities around the world. I think it's broadening, it's becoming more diverse in the way it presents suggestions and examples of lesbians kind of leading full lives culturally and politically, and much more kind of attention to, creating sort of lesbian families, lesbian kind of lesbians in a much more array of like a bigger presence in society generally, and sort of just reflecting that and kind of much more attention to lifestyle and lifestyle politics. But still also a lot of concerted effort to reflect lesbian news and lesbian activism by sort of smaller community groups and activist networks that communicate still amongst each other, even if not in kind of formal publications or online, but yeah, it still exists.
And that's about publishing, but what about you? So what's your next stage for this research? And then also, are you thinking of, is this a phase? Is there another piece of research that will follow on from this? Or will your next project be something quite different?
Well, I'm very lucky to work alongside colleagues that are similarly interested in the 1990s and early 2000s into the present, for how lesbian and queer communities were developing, and not just sort of developing amongst each other, but from within their communities, from within these contexts of facing homophobia, sexism, trying to sort of support each other, build solidarity, build wellbeing, build community, creating these amazing strategies for empowerment, sexual health activism that really informed a lot of kind of community care practices into the 2000s, and have been really key parts of queer community building. So I think that is something that I am focusing on now, with colleagues also interested in this period. So basically just the kind of creative trajectories and pathways that these lesbians in the 90s who were doing so many different things to assert lesbian visibility, assert more discussions about lesbian visibility in Mardi Gras or in health, and where that went, and the amazing kind of things that led to in Sydney, in New South Wales and broader Australia. So that is my next stage.
Just see if we've got any more questions. Somebody has volunteered that Wicked Women has been digitised. The Australian Queer Archives collection set has been digitised. So that's available through Gale, Archives of Sexuality and Gender. So if you have a university library card, or you have a state library card, whether it's the State Library of New South Wales or any other state, you can log on online and go to that resource within that library's e-resources portal. They all do it slightly differently. So I can't give you a quick path into that, but that is fantastic to know that that's there. But maybe someone will want to duplicate that and have that a bit more easily accessible in Trove, because that Trove viewer is also quite good for the magazines as well. And it's quite easy to sort of, and slightly spectacular. You have all those issues up, you can see all the covers at a glance and sort of scroll through, and even just the cover design and looking at how that's changed over the years is, there's a paper just in that, I think.
Absolutely. It's a dream to work with that kind of archive online. It's excellent.
And somebody is also giving a plug to the Jessie Street National Women's Library. It's an excellent archival source for anybody who's researching women's lesbian history. And they, I did not know this, they are slowly digitising everything. So while it's great to be able to sit in fabulous reading rooms and be surrounded by boxes of stuff, it's fabulous that lots of people are investing time and resources into digitising collections so that we can access those from home. So I think, oh, one more comment. Not all lesbians want to be queer, and I want to thank Sophie, Rachel and the State Library for this session. It is so important that we've got this information and understanding about lesbians, and it's available and it's mainstream and it's here for everybody, and they're excited that it's going to be recorded. Well, we have recorded it, but somebody has asked when the recording will be available. So because we are a government agency, the State Library of New South Wales, we need to make sure that our content is as accessible as possible. So what we'll do is once this recording has been downloaded, we will actually caption Sophie's presentation today, so it's really accessible. And once that's done, we will put that up online on the library's website. We are trying to revamp that page so it's a little bit easier to find. We have all sorts of recordings up there at the moment. We have scholar talks, author talks, science talks, all sorts of good stuff. But if you would like to be kept on a mailing list and you'd like to be notified when this particular talk is available online or we have posted new content, then please email me at scholarship@sl.nsw.gov.au. So that's scholarship@sl for State Library.nsw.gov.au, and we'll put you on the mailing list and we'll send out note. Usually every month we advertise the upcoming Scholar Talk, the upcoming History Matters, which is tomorrow night, Saltwater Histories. There are still tickets available for that. And we'll also be letting people know when recordings of talks are available. So if there are no more questions for Sophie, I'm going to give a shameless plug for next month's Scholar Talk. So next month we have Tess Gardner. So Tess is part of the library's Visiting Scholar program. So as well as our paid fellows, we also have visiting scholars who we give all the same privileges of a fellowship to. We just don't give them any funding. So a lot of them are students, which is really lovely to be able to support PhD candidates doing rich archival research. So Tess is doing her PhD at the Australian National University and has been using the library's collections to research Australian journalists in the 1911 Chinese Revolution. So if you want to ask all sorts of interesting and complicated questions about the free press and early journalism, do join us next month for Tessa's talk. She'll be on the 7th of September at 11 o'clock. Otherwise, I hope that you are all safe and sane this lockdown. If you want a little bit of company, just jump onto the library's website. There's so much stuff that we're trying to do online. If you want a bit of engagement and to chat and use that chat feature in Zoom, or you just want some other voices into your small space of where you're living, we're here and we have lots of options. Otherwise, thank you so much, Sophie. Juggling this on top of all the other things you're doing. Appreciate you being with us this morning. And thank you. It was such a huge crowd this morning. It was great to have so many people with us online. Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.